In the United States, we have something called the Selective Service Act. This is a database of people potentially subject to being drafted into the military. And the way it works is that when you turn 18, I did it when I turned 18, you have 30 days to register with Selective Service. Now, for a long time, this only applied to men because the U.S. Army has had a ground combat exclusion policy dating back to 1948, when the Women's Armed Services Integration Act specifically said women are excluded from combat positions in the military. So as a result, women did not have to register with Selective Service. You might hear that and say, well, hold on a second. That seems to violate equal protection. Men are required to register. Women are not required to register. There's something inherently unfair about that. It actually went to the Supreme Court. Back in 1981, there was a case called Rosker versus Goldberg, and the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that it's constitutional to only require men to register, specifically because the purpose of Selective Service is to have a prepared combat troop draft. And since women were, as I mentioned, exempt from combat roles, there's really no problem. I never thought this was a very good argument, to be perfectly honest. There was nothing ever stopping the government from drafting women for non-combat roles. If they registered with Selective Service, they could have still registered in spite of that exclusion. But be that as it may, this exclusion of women has changed over the last 20 or so years. Back in 1993, the combat exclusion for women was removed from aviation positions. And then in 1994, the Pentagon went even further, saying that service members are eligible to be assigned for all positions for which they are qualified aside from sex. In 2001, there was a commission headed by Lester Lyles, a retired Air Force general, who recommended eliminating the policy, saying it's a hindrance to promotion and it actually hurts women. And then in February of 2012, there was a review of Pentagon policies, and it lifted restrictions, gender restrictions, on 14,000 military positions. And then finally, in 2013, the combat exclusion policy was lifted altogether. Men and women were all made eligible to serve in frontline combat, participate in combat operations. So what's the important takeaway? Well, if women now can serve in combat roles, the rationale for keeping them, for not forcing them, not requiring them to register for Selective Service has sort of evaporated. So various branches of the military were given until January of 2016 to implement the changes. And now we actually saw a committee proposal pass, barely 32 to 30, that says women should start registering for Selective Service. Now, here's what's amazing, Lewis. This proposal passed 32 to 30 in spite of the author of the proposal voting against his own proposal. This was Duncan Hunter, who proposed this as a sort of way to say, well, this is just ridiculous to allow women in combat roles. We might as well make them register for Selective Service. It went to the committee, and the committee said, yeah, actually, that makes sense. So Hunter ended up voting against his own proposal, which is amazing. My position on this is similar to my position about the tests for women firefighters or whatever else. If you have requirements that must be met, how do I want to say this? For reasons specific to the job, then the requirements should be the same for men and women. And if you pass, who cares whether you're male or female? An example would be, for example, on distance running, right? Sometimes fitness requirements say men must run a mile in 8 minutes and women in 9. I'm making the numbers up, doesn't matter. But the requirement is more strict for men. We know that men tend to run, all else being equal, faster. Men tend to be generally taller. Men tend to have more muscle mass. So we see this in races and marathons, 5Ks, whatever. There are physical differences, and men tend to run faster. If the job requires, for a specific reason, that you must run an 8-minute mile, then the requirement for everybody, Lewis, should be an 8-minute mile. If the idea is we want to have individuals in the top 5% of fitness, then it makes sense that we would have a different mile requirement for men and women. It really depends on what the point of the requirement is. Is it inherently necessary for the job? Excuse me. Or are we trying to sort of get the top X% of men and women? And that's what it should be based on. Otherwise, why would anyone have a problem? If you have met the requirements that have been determined to be necessary for a particular position, why should your genitalia keep you out of that position?
No, it shouldn't. And recently there was a woman, maybe two, who passed the Army Rangers, I believe.
Yeah.
Rangers or maybe it was Green Beret. I don't know. The physical requirements for that. It
Right.
made headlines. It was a really big story. And, you know, they didn't change the requirements. And you're right. They shouldn't.
If you have a position, to give just another example, if you have a position where on a day-to-day basis you have to carry 150 pounds 100 yards, right, or drag it or whatever the task is, if you need to be able to move the 150 pounds by yourself, then the requirement, regardless of male female, should be that you can pass a test where you carry or drag or whatever the 150 pounds. If the idea, though, is we want to have fit men and fit women, but there's nothing actually in the job that requires you to carry the 150 pounds, then you adjust that 150-pound requirement for men and for women based on the physical differences between men and women. Who could have a problem with that, Lewis?
Yeah, I mean, now we're getting into every job having all these different requirements, and things get a little more complicated there. But I mean, I'd rather just focus on the jobs that do have these very strict physical requirements and say, keep them the same. I mean, yeah, pass it if you can. What's wrong with that? And most soldiers, in this case that we're talking about,
Yeah.
I think would agree with that.
Yeah, I haven't seen data on that. Do they? I mean, is that generally?
Well, I mean, maybe the only ones I'm hearing from are the ones that come out and say this is fine with me.
Yeah.
Because maybe they're the only ones that get coverage, but that's what I've been seeing.
Send me your thoughts on this. Am I missing some key reason why women should not be allowed to serve in combat roles if indeed they have passed the requirements that are put in place? I'm on Twitter at @Pakman. Lewis is on Twitter at Lewis Motamedi.